So this will be a little Q&A group discussion. First day. I know we had 3 talks today. Moving forward, the plan is to do 2 talks and 2 Q&As. But today we ended up I did my own kind of impromptu Rave Cosmology talk, and then I did bass theory, and then you had your encounter in Rave Cosmology, and just kind of setting the stage for what you're going to do tomorrow, I know. And so yeah, if anyone has any questions, comments, things that they're interested in, things they want to learn. I guess the bass talk I did was the most technical. That one was kind of, which, my idea was I didn't really want to go too technical. I was kind of, like, your thing was so perfect because I was kind of, that's what I was hoping. It was like storytelling. In the description for the event that we've done, I kind of wrote it as, let's make it more like storytelling, like what we do around the fire, which we might literally be doing tomorrow for those who go camping. So, but yeah, I guess just starting with the first one. So my first talk, Rave Cosmology talk, I called From the Big Bang to the Aeron, and that was just really talking about decision making and where we are. And I didn't give away too much in there, because I knew you would. I just kind of gave a little hints about it. But any questions from that one? Comments, ideas?
I was kind of confused about base 4. I can't remember my line of thought then, but...
From the second talk, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you associate it with kind of like the imaginal realm, I think, in the first talk, and then the next one you called it the ego. And I was thinking, is because I have inner vision cognition, and it almost sounded like that tone or something, like inner vision, like it's building.
It is more like inner vision,
and
it is interesting that it's called the ego. That's a little bit complex because it's also called the design and relates to the unconscious, or the designer,
right,
or the
which
dreamer.
Is very inner vision cognition in a way of building your own internal
yes,
world.
absolutely. At the surface level, I think tone 4 does relate to base 4, and you can see continuities between them, like I was talking about with 5 as well, and fantasy, sound, feeling, and then going into the projection field at the line level. And so there are certain continuities. The way I think of base 4 at the subjective level as a subjective experience, if you ever had a dream, I had a dream where I was it was a lucid dream. I used to have a lot of lucid dreams. And I was in a music store, and I thought, wow, so many records and tapes. They all had names on them. And then I went, okay, well, that's one thing. Good job, dreamer. You came up with names for this, but let's put one in. Sure enough. I'm like, okay, all right, try another one. Another song I hadn't heard. Another one. I could put in tapes all day long and hear real songs that I had not heard, right, that were all written somehow by the dreamer. So, when we hear the design as that dimension, it's almost the designer. You could say that it's the personality and the design. Well, it's also the personality and the designer who designs the unconscious experience that you have in a psychedelic trip, in a dream, in a inner vision thing, And so obviously these two relate to each other, like memory creates images. And so what is that? That base 2 connecting to base 4? Or is there an imagistic component of memory as well, compared to what is purely base 4? But in some sense, it is like the designer. Now, how does it relate to the ego? That's a really unusual keynote there, and there's a lot of head scratchers when we get into bass. All I can think is James Hillman's great essay, The Thought of the Heart, where he said it's only in recent attributions we consider the heart to be attributed only to feeling, but that the heart is actually, and was thought through all the Middle Ages and different times to be about thinking, that you think with your heart, and the matters of the heart, you're kind of they're weighing on you, you're processing and digesting and thinking about what you do with that. I don't exactly know why the ego would also be the design. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Well, there's like measure, so as a center, the ego is so much about like valuation, right? And what has value, whatever. So there's this relationship of value to measure, to design and arranging.
I always think of measure as mind, but you're right that the mind is what measures and compares, but the mind connects to the design.
The mind measures with a rubric. It's like there's this weightiness to the measure of values or whatever, or to the doling out of values, or it's like
stronger or weaker, heavier or lighter.
Yeah,
that's what the mind is doing.
Oh, I see.
Well, the mind is gravity and it's weight and it's weighting.
Okay.
But the design is creating a system, so it is arranging.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I guess when you create a system, is that a hierarchy? I mean, I guess that is another form of weighting, that one is more important than the other. I mean, it's a really good question. These are great questions of why would the ego keynote also be the design, and that does it appear at the surface as both the ego center, the heart center. Can we be that literal? I mean, not every base has a center, right? Is the ego base seen at the surface as the ego center?
Well, what does that have in common with the ego center is kind of what you're asking.
Yeah, that would be a better question then, right? Because not every base has a direct keynote relationship.
So the ego compared to the self, when you look at heart and G, the ego is the self as a social unit, as a socially negotiated self. You know, the social self is the ego, the whatever, cosmic self, cosmic identity.
I see, the tribal self is the ego.
Yeah, the tribal self.
And the other interesting thing is that...
Can I link it into that design thing? Yeah, well, just that that is also very much like arranging and designing, negotiating who you are, socially defined. Or
designing your social persona.
Yeah. In the same way that you said it's like designing a trip for yourself or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I think of social persona almost even more as like solar plexus. So I don't know if the ego as a social unit is like how you present even necessarily. It is sort of like how you have partitioned stock in yourself about what
has value or not.
Yeah, or where you have value and what kind of value, because you have value everywhere you go, but it's like what value do you have in this space and that space with these people, with that people.
And I see what you're saying about the solar plexus being more of what you let people see.
Yeah.
Because the undefined solar plexus, for instance, hides. Although the defined solar plexus can hide too, by the way.
Oh yeah.
Can hide from painful truths and so on. But that's where we get real. Whereas I see you're saying that the ego is more where we bargain and we say, socially speaking, I'll do this for you, or look what value I provided here, look how much I do, I delivered.
Right.
You know.
And it's usually not so explicit, right? It's just sort of like there are certain people that you're like, based on what the sort of tribal sensibility of the situation is, you are more or less comfortable, like, you know, putting your feet on their couch or whatever, you know, even if you're meeting these people for the first time, you know, it's like this instantaneous tribal negotiation because of like what the tribal precedent is. You know, because it's so, and in some sense that's like still mediated by the way that people are choosing to show up through the like solar plexus presentation stuff, but still it's like, and that's not really the same as code switching either. It really is just like, this is what this tribe is, and these are the kinds of things I can or can't get away with in this tribe, even if you're just meeting these people, right?
But I also wonder where the tribal aspects come from at the base level. And if that's not more base 3, only because it's interesting. Base 2, obviously we have the keynote of spirit, and that does relate to the G center. You would think, okay, but what about self? Well, self is considered a component of ego, not the other way around. And interestingly, what Ra says about the self in base keynoting is that is the domain or the area within which ego competes.
Cool.
And the other thing, when Ra describes base 4, he essentially, as a base 4 himself, he says, if there weren't base 4s, everyone would be sheep. So everyone would just, like in a situation where people are being told what to do, nobody would stand up. Or in a situation where people are being oppressed, nobody would fight the oppressor. They would all be cowardly. They would all be docile. They would all be easily domesticated and easily... So it's weird because we think of the ego as so tribal, but he's describing it more in its, I mean, almost like individual keynoting of being this rugged, I won't do what you tell me.
Right.
But it's not yet individuality or uniqueness, which is in base 1.
Right.
How we uniquely move through the world
is
simply...
go on.
Well, it's almost like resistance.
Yeah.
That which resists others. That which resists being told what to do or being controlled.
But it's still social because it is you do what I say, right, with base 4.
Yes, right. That's something that we're going to talk about tomorrow without giving away too much. We're going to tell the story of bases. I am going to tell the story of bases through like their social function, if you will. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like designing or arranging a new way to be together or whatever, instead of just like automatically deferring to like, everybody holding hands or cooperating for cooperation's sake, which is like how you describe base 3 a lot of the time.
Yeah, base 3 helps people get along. And so this is so there's the exoteric and the esoteric view. And so from the exoteric view, which we're going to go into tomorrow, so I don't want to give away too much of it because that'll kind of spoil the talk, we're going to be approaching it from what is the function of the bases in society. And I touched on it saying, well, yeah, base 3 helps people get along, things like that. But then there's also the interior experience of going into that base as a subjectively lived dimension or phenomenological experience. And with base 3, I was saying that's the experience of the body. And with base 4, I was saying that's the experience of what Ashley was saying. It sounds pretty much like inner vision. And I do think it is. I mean, base 2 is taste and tone 2 is taste. There are some pretty interesting
base 3
comparisons
vision,
here.
Body. It's interesting because it's very much about the Maya.
Yeah. So there are some interesting. Right, exactly. It is, and it's objectivity and outer vision is about what we use to determine objectivity. I saw it. It must be true.
But then what about tone 6?
Well, tone 6 is a sort of synthetic tone that doesn't have. I mean, this
combination of all of them.
No, that's what 5
But
is.
it's like
I mean, this is why Ra kind of says there are only 5 lines. The 6th line is no line. There are only 5 colors. The 6th color is no motivation.
Well, it's interesting too because the 6th tone seems very like of the future as well, like what we're moving towards, not necessarily something we fully grasp yet because it's about the solar plexus and it mutating.
Yeah, but it's also kind of transitional. I mean, all of these 6s are. I mean, it's not like there will be eventually another base that will fill it in. It's like there's 4 bases, then there's one that's a synthesis, and then there's one that's none of them.
Yeah.
It's a way to look at it, right? There's 4 actual things. One of them is the combination of all those things. So it's like if you have 4, you got to have 5 too, because you have something that is all of those taken together as a whole.
Sure.
But then if you have 5, you also get, like I started in the first talk, talking about the generalized function of negation that can imagine not this. It's like you have 4, all, and none. And that would be, the 5 is the all, and the 6 is the none.
That makes sense. The 6 being on the roof and really kind of over all of
Over all of it. I'm not any of those things.
Yeah.
And it's hard to generalize about me because, that's kind of the 6, right? So, yeah. Yeah, but it's interesting. I mean, the keynoting contains a lot of mysteries. Like, when we look at base 4 being design, but also being the ego, and it's like, does the ego center then have some connection to the design side that we're not aware of? I mean, you would think that would be, if anything, the connection to the design side would be the magnetic monopole and the G center with its love affair with the design crystal and the ajna. But not, you know what I mean? So I think it's,
you made me think about how like the design side is not really the body either. It's more like the life. It's like John Martin, that's what he'd always refer to the design as, because it's not really the body either. And it's not really sensory based either. It's something else, kind of.
Exactly, and that's a really good point that I think needs to be brought up more, is that people saying that they're living their design because they're following their impulses may just be people with poor impulse control. So, I mean, like, I had the impulse to eat it, so I ate it. Like, well, okay, but...
Are you happy about that?
Yeah, exactly. Did that bring satisfaction, or did you bring a bunch of resistance? The proof is in the resistance or not. And that was one of the topics of my first talk, which is, I wrote about decision and indecision, was the header. And I was thinking, where does the decision occur? In the form. Where does the indecision occur? In the personality. And if the personality's indecision can remain indecision, wonderful. But when it imposes that indecision on the form and doesn't allow the decision to occur, because it says, I haven't had enough time, I don't have clarity yet, so I'm going to wait to make the decision. Well, you don't get to wait to make the decision. That is a decision. That's the decision, no. But the indecision creates all of this chaos because the proper place for the passenger in its indecision, in its indecisiveness, is to just stay out of it and let the decision occur on the side of the form. I mean, I think one of the themes I was coming up with today was really this complementarity, like when we talked about Quentin Melissu and how his proof for why there must be something more than the atomic matter, basically his proof for why design must be real, the design side of the cosmos, if we could call it that, meaning the non-atomic side, the 5 dimensions of base, is that nothing that actually exists in the world atomically is necessary, because if it's destroyed, the world continues. Hence, the opposite. something that doesn't exist must be necessary. If nothing exists that's necessary, but we still have necessity, the concept of necessity, then something non-atomic, something that doesn't, no single tree or single stone or, is necessary. But what is necessary? Something beyond our horizons, which is why he urges us to venture to the great outdoors, as he calls it. So that was in the first talk of the day. We kind of went into Ray Brassier and then Quentin Melissu as two polar opposites in using similar arguments but having different conclusions. Ray Brassier says the eventual heat death of the universe will retroactively render everything that came before it moot and meaningless. In his book Nile Unbound.
Wow.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Quentin Melissu says in a thought experiment, what if the Christians are right and we have an eternal afterlife, or any religious, not just Christians, and that retroactively, that eternal afterlife retroactively shows everything that came before it in a different light. Even, you know what I mean? Like, no matter what happens. In fact, there's a great quip from Melissu where he said, essentially, it's not only, it's kind of like Occam's razor. He says, yes, the sun continues to rise. There's always a new day. But there's no guarantee. No amount of sunrises mean it's going to rise tomorrow, basically. No amount of past evidence will ever guarantee the future outcome. So even if every single moment of every single life on Earth was in a materialist way, there's still the possibility that something could happen, like an eternal afterlife, after death or something, where they're like, okay, so now, now you see that the truth of all of this non-materialist stuff. So he was basically always keeping the door open for materialism to be wrong, because it could never prove tomorrow, basically.
Wow.
So I really liked that. But just in terms of the decision making, I mean, the first talk for me was all about what are we doing, where are we? We're between the Big Bang and the Aeon. I mean, it's a pretty wide thing, but more specifically, we're in around the last 1,300 years until Earth is destroyed, and that is a lot more realistic. I mean, when people say save the environment, it's like, yeah, save it for the next 1,300 years. Save it enough that we can continue our decision-making experiment. Eventually, it's going to be destroyed. And I think that breaks a lot of people's hearts to imagine. But long before it's destroyed, the last copy ever of your favorite album will play with the last electricity ever. You know what I mean? There's a whole way to get there. I mean, it's not just like we go 1,300 years and we're at peak culture and it's destroyed. 400 years from now, there's probably no internet, and some far future reincarnation of John Lennon is listening to the very last copy of the very last Beatles record on the very last turntable through a half-broken speaker using the very last electricity or crank that people have figured out by then. I mean, we're heading to the post-apocalypse. We had a big breath in, and now we're in the breath out. And this is something Mike has helped me understand in a big way with the role of projectors and arranging, making use of what's already been built. We've built so much, and as a generator, I just think, oh, we're going to face problems? Let's build more. But what about lithium running out? What about, and so on. And as we have limited resources, it becomes a new question, not how do we build more, how do we use what we have in different ways? And is that not what human design is? Instead of building a new mysticism, isn't it kind of the last mysticism that just helps us put the other mysticisms in their correct places? So that's my thought on it. Yeah,
it's nice that we get to have a denouement here and aren't just crooked off stage. That we don't build a better civilization and then it ends while everyone's still enjoying it, but we get to kind of have our whittling down our little.
Right, we get to see the embers until the last ember fades. I mean, we get to really. We're at this great meridian of time of peak population where now the population is declining, or will be. Already, I mean, there's a really interesting fact, which is decade after decade, they had to keep changing IQ tests because IQ is supposed to be the average, but people kept getting higher and higher averages. They wanted the average score to be 100, so they had to keep making the questions harder and harder and harder. And the IQ test from the 1930s, people now on average would test 130, 140, 150. From the 1950s, they would now test 120, 115, and so on. But now, for the last, since around the 2000, actually, for the last 2 decades, they've had to make the questions easier to maintain.
Wow.
Oh.
To maintain, 100.
That's
That somebody would have scored 100 back in 2000, now they would score 90. So they had to make the questions easier so that they can still score 100 on average.
Best.
Because intelligence also is now doing this. So, that's the thing. It's...
But is it also like our strategic capacities going down? Because that's also very much what like test.
Could be. Yeah, absolutely. Right. You're saying maybe there's just more right variable consciousness
Right.
and we're gaining emotional awareness. Absolutely. So, obviously there are many intelligences. But, yeah, it's all those things. We're losing a lot of...
That's interesting.
Yeah, we're just losing a lot of what we had.
I thought you were saying.
And we'll go into global cycles in a couple days, so I don't want to spoil too much of that either. But I do really like your point, Mike, about just how the role of the projector emerging right at the time when they're needed to orchestrate, guide, arrange. There's something even connected. It's funny because base 4 is mostly associated with the manifestor. In fact, manifestation is one of its keynotes. But arranging, curating, and so on seems like such a projector trait. And obviously when you look at the diagrams, you have different interpretations as well. Is it the reflector or the projector diagram?
What?
Base 4.
It's the
projector.
It's
right?
projector. Yeah.
So, and what that just means is that if you look at the four types, not including manifesting generators, which I guess could be like base 5 or something. I don't really know. They're kind of like the extra
kind
type.
Of appropriate.
Yeah, the synthesis of the other types. But if you look at the others, you can see that the generator is fully yin and manifestor is fully yang, and then the others are a combination of them. And that's why I really disagreed with Brynja Magnuson's talk where she talked about projectors as fully yin. It didn't make sense to me at all. Generators are the most yin there are. Projectors have pointed, piercing auras, and part of that piercing is the yang ability. But then they're yin in that they have to be invited and welcomed in, and they're not double yang. They're not like manifestors where they're like, I'm going to tell you what to do, and you don't have to invite me. Projectors are like, I'm going to tell you what to do once you invited me. So you have to. That was how Rob would always laugh about that. That he's like, they're going to replace us. You have to beg them to rule your life and control you and manage you. Like. He just did it. So, yeah, kind of an interesting perspective on it. But just in terms of our evolutionary moment, going into the future where we need projectors, why do we need them so much? Because we can't just build our way out of things, right? Because the manifestor would work with the generator to get them to build more things. The projector works with the generator to get them to use their energy differently. Not just like, okay, that broke, let's build a new one. But like, that broke and we can't build a new one because we don't have the large-scale infrastructure to build anything. So let's use our energy in a different way that will best facilitate survival and flourishing of the human spirit and species.
Yeah, where does your energy want to go? What do you want?
That too. Yeah, and also what's needed. We still need to do what's needed. Some of us want to fulfill our purpose in helping what's needed, but it's not that we just can't build our way out of it anymore. Right. Large-scale FDR style, build more railroads, not going to work. We're not in that build our way out of it solution anymore. We're in how do we use what we already have in a different arrangement. And that's what
I feel like projectors are also here to teach acceptance, because when it comes to projectors and the end of the world, it's like, okay, what's already here? But it's also... Like I was thinking about this the other day, what I would do if the world was going to end in like 5 minutes, right? It's like you would stop, you would slow down, you would wait. Like you're not necessarily going to be like, I need to go and look at the ocean one last time, or I need to go and do this, or even I need to be with my person if they're not right next to you. It's like you would just kind of actually wait and like welcome that death. And if we're at that final stage, it's like there's also a lot of acceptance that in order for us to find that peace of what's to come, right? It's not just how do we end this with grace. With the grace, it also requires acceptance. And I feel like as projectors, there's a lot we have to accept as being non-sacral beings. And I guess for me as a 6-2, I always think about like what my own acceptance, what that lesson is for me and then for others as well. And so I feel like there's also acceptance for This is what we have, and that's why we're going to work with what we have.
Yeah, helping generators helping them to accept their lot in life, but also because of the mastery of systems and being efficient and so on, they're like, is this really how you want to spend your time? Are you guys just going to work right up to the end? Or if you are working, maybe you can work in efficient ways that allow you to take care of the things you don't need to do, so you can really, I see projectors as helping people fulfill their life purpose, and we only have 1,300 years left. That was really why I did that first talk. The first talk was not planned, but I kind of threw the slides together from it. I just made all those slides after I came back based on our conversation. I went on this nice walk with Pockets and Krista and Kalea, and we just had a great conversation. I was like, I'll just put that in slides. So I came back and just made some quick slides. I'm a builder. Let's build some slides. And I was thinking it's such a nice way to start it, because it's really it's so open-ended to think life goes on, and the perspective of just, this is my one life. What's my life purpose? My life purpose is so important. And also the world is being destroyed and it's so sad, we have to save the world. Well, okay, now let's change that. It's not my one life. But we still do only have 1,300 years. So even if you had a lot of lives, it's not that many left compared to what we had before. But also, not just what is my one life purpose, but what is the overall project, of which each life purpose is a step towards fulfilling that project. And then third, we don't have to save the world forever. We just have to make it decently livable for the next 1,300 years. So, let's end world hunger. Let's do things that actually, if you told me, like, okay, Jonah, do you want to save, there's a huge unpopulated area, do you want to save that area from forest fires or end hunger for, an equivalent amount of humans that would populate a certain area? Like hunger for sure, because the human experiment, not to say that the animals that are going extinct, we shouldn't feel sorry for them, not to say we shouldn't feel sorry for the polluted oceans or things like that, but let's feel sorry for the humans a little bit too, because we're the ones that are really here furthering the evolutionary experiment. Like, I guess all I'm saying, this is really heretical, but there's so much thought in philosophy that is against human centrism and saying, well, humans aren't special. And it's like, yes, we are. Actually, we are special, because our suffering is very different from other suffering. We can prove it with human design. We can see that the greater capacity for suffering that emerges. It actually gives me a comfort when I look back at the seven-centered being and I see how terrible they were to each other, that they actually didn't suffer as much as us, because they weren't as sensitive as us to that suffering, and they didn't have the same capacity to suffer. But also, besides that, there's a great quote from Oscar Wilde, which is, it's easy to gain sympathy for suffering. It's difficult to get sympathy for ideas. And maybe that is where the projectors can really help us with the acceptance and say, like, yes, I sympathize with your suffering, but we also, here's an idea. Maybe what we're all invested in is not as important anymore. We need to reshift our attention to something else. And maybe just accepting that the world is just being destroyed. Not to say that we shouldn't do our part, but how much recycling? Like, at what point does recycling stop mattering? 1,295 years in the future, 5 years left? It's not going to matter by then. Well, let's play that mind game and move it back then. At what point does it stop mattering? Because obviously we're trying to save the world, but for what? For future generations. Okay, I agree with that. Good. Because we will be in those future generations and our future incarnations, and we need the world to not be totally screwed up so we can continue our experiments and decision making without toxic gas and fires and boiling rivers and whatever. Yeah, absolutely. But at a certain point, we're not saving the world for the world, we're saving the world for us. That's what I'm trying to say. Because we are the ones that are in the experiment and decision making, and ultimately that experiment will serve the totality after the world is destroyed, in the far future, when all of the decision making we've made will have been the practice that helps us make the right decision later. So that's my heresy for the day. I'm not saying I'm not an environmentalist. I'm just saying, ending world hunger, environmentalism. Let's end world hunger.
Aren't they already finding new creatures on the garbage islands and stuff?
Are they? I haven't heard that. Yeah, I know there's that, three-eyed fish from the Simpsons. That'll be the. So anyway, that was my rant for the day. That over rant. Well, any other? So that was kind of the first topic: decision making, far future, base. Any other base questions? I guess base 4. That was a good one.
I have a base question.
Sure.
You know how with the lines, like how 1 feeds into 2 and then into 3 and so on and so forth, like does that work with base as well? Like do they feed into each other?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I'm sure I got that impression.
Well, obviously there are problems because like base 1 and 2 don't connect, right? And so, but how does it?
I
but
don't
it's
understand why it doesn't connect.
well, I mean, and I guess we have to qualify what we mean by connecting. But an example would be at the microcosmic level, that mind and movement. It's very hard to be doing sports or ballet or something and also remembering a bunch of stuff. Mm-hmm. Like when you go into the dimension of pure movement, you are losing touch with the dimension of mind. It's also very hard to go into that mind space when there's a whole bunch of movement happening and reactivity and reactions and things interrupting and so on. It's like the ability to stay in that mind space and that zone of indetermination that is the mind is difficult. It can get shaken out of it and it can get really reactive. So I think we've seen a few examples today of the mind getting disrupted and becoming reactive through interruption and things like that. But that's all at the subjective internal level, and tomorrow we're going to tell the story from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 at the exoteric evolutionary level, starting with what were the base 1 people doing at the beginning of time, and once they've done their job, the base 2 will come in and go, okay, now it's our turn to do our job. Then the base 3 come in and so on. And so that'll be sort of the story from outside. Today we started with the story from the cockpit and from going into the different dimensions internally through our own experience, because we all have the experience of being in a reverie or dancing and losing ourselves, or being in the body so much, or these different ones, being in a visionary state. So yeah, but that's a really good question, and there is absolutely a sequence. As far as the second part of that being like, why are 1 and 2 so disconnected? They're really just, they're 2 competing versions of the same thing. It's like when we start with yin and yang, there's 2 yins and there's 2 yangs. They compete with each other, and each one's like, this is the right way to be yin. Like, no, that's the right way to be yin.
It's like starting
two fundamental, 2 starting points. It's all about division, and so it keeps dividing. And that was that quote I read about how yin and yang divide into 4, and then that divides into the 8 trigrams, which combine to make the hexagrams. Once you have 8 trigrams, you can combine them in every possible combination to make the 64 hexagrams. So it's a pretty short throw from base to the hexagrams. Like pretty direct line.
Right, I was going to ask that, because if it's yin and yang, 2 lines, and then the hexagrams are like a combination of yin and yang, like stacked on top of each other.
Yeah, so the way it looks hierarchically is this. So you start with yin and yang, let's say male and female, or I guess female and male, and is yin, right? Just at that level, and then symbolically in Chinese esotericism, they then say, well, there's elder female and there's younger female. There's elder young and there's younger. So they say mother, daughter, father, son, and those are the 4 ways of looking at it, and those are the diagrams. The mother is yin yin, the daughter is yang yin, and then it goes to the other side, and it's yang yang, the father, which is and then yang yang, and then yin yang. So we'll go. It's every permutation. But what's interesting is from there, you can now just add 1 more line to each of those, and you suddenly have the 8 trigrams. Because from those 4, you just add a single line to each one more, and now you have, which is either yin or yang. So it like doubles it. So from that, you now have 8 trigrams. And maybe we could even look at the trigrams later. They're really fun. It's such a visual system, and just learning the trigrams, it's hard to talk about it, but when you see it, you can really, there's a lot of magic in them, and just, it's a very ancient symbolic language.
So then like gate 1, what is the yang to yin combination?
Well, it's all yang.
It's all yang, okay.
Yeah.
And then 2 would be all yin.
Yep.
Okay.
Exactly. But what's interesting is, you can construct them from diagrams, and obviously there's ways to do that are interesting, but if you just start hierarchically, you start with a single yang and a single yin, that splits into father, son, mother, daughter. And then for each of those, you add a yin or yang, and that now goes to the 8 trigrams. And from those 8 trigrams, you combine one with the other and 8 times 8, you have 64 hexagrams. So it really just goes 1, 2, 4, 8, 64.
Or in between those two steps, you could also just add one more line and get all the godheads.
That's true. You can get to the 16 godheads, or you could get to the 32 gates of each half, or something like that.
Yeah.
Or I guess the 16 of the quarter. Sorry, there's 16 godheads, but there's, if you go into 16 gates, that's actually the quarters. The godheads are 4 gates at a time. So anyway, there's different ways of splitting it up, but at a very basic level, you don't really need more than, like, and this is not even human design, this is just traditional Chinese philosophy. It just goes 1, 2, 4, 8, 64. Because once you have 8, you just combine every permutation of those 8, and now you have 64. So, yeah, and so, I mean, we can see how the whole system comes from base, because base is just this fundamental set of divisions. But then the question's like, why are base 1 and 2 incompatible? I guess they're just competing. It's kind of the father and the son are competing, like the two ways to be a man, or the mother and the daughter, the two forms of femininity. And it is interesting also, because obviously we don't want to be too strict with the gendering, but Ra did say that he thought 80% plus of double yang incarnations were male, or assigned male at birth, would be the term now. I didn't really use that term as much then. And then same for the double yin. So basically base 1 is primarily male, base 3 is predominantly female, and I'm base 2, so I would have theoretically had a combination of male and female lives, or at least had possibly more female lives. But because I have more yin. But it's an interesting question. I like that you have Ravi Shankar as your ringtone. It's a
No,
much
it
more
just randomly
pleasant.
started playing, like on my YouTube or something.
Okay. Well, maybe that's a good place to wrap it up, unless anyone has any more base questions, anything at all. Well, this has been really enjoyable. Thanks for getting mystical. It's been a really mystical day. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Yeah.
We'll see what we end up doing tonight. Maybe we can catch some thrift stores, see what you have in mind, anything at all. And then tomorrow, I'll be doing the story of base kind of from the exoteric, and in the afternoon, Mike will be doing some Rave Cosmology. Sounds like we got Aaron coming, so that'll be great. Tomorrow afternoon, then we go camping after Mike's time. Anyone who wants to go camping, and I imagine at least one person will come back from there, but I wouldn't guarantee it because it's so beautiful. But I know some people are like, well, maybe I'll go check it out. It's only an hour away. If we go to Rio Chama, that's more like an hour and a half.
Yeah.
Hour and 45. Anyway, it'll be good. So, all right, thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.